So in this video, I'm going to introduce you to what might be some seemingly obscure information about what we in higher ed mean by contact hours, and the federal definition of a credit hour, etc. And the reason this is particularly important is that those of you that are teaching blended or blended with an online pathway courses really need to think a lot about scheduling as you're designing your courses, and we want to make sure that you have have the freedom to do as much creative thinking as you can. And so it'll be really helpful for you to know what the boundaries are around what you can do so that you can create some creative plans for cohorting and scheduling your students as we move into the fall. So let's start with talking about the federal credit hour. This actually comes from financial aid law. And I should say that this law is a very soft law legislation. They actually say that institutions can interpret this guidance any way that they want, but it turns out that Wake Forest and most other institutions pretty much follow this pretty consistently, and so it's worth it as our baseline. So essentially the federal regulation says that 1 credit hour of a semester credit hour of work for a college student requires that a student spend at least 1 hour in class and 2 hours out of class for approximately 15 weeks. So in a 1 credit hour course, that works out to about 45 hours of work that a student needs to spend to get a credit hour, with about 30 of those being at home and 15 of those being in class. In a 3 credit hour course, which is what many of you teach, and I hope that those of you that don't teach 3 credit hour courses can do the math, what we're asking is that students put forth about 135 hours of work, with about 90 of those hours being at home and about 45 of those hours being in class. Now, one of the things that you should know is that registrars who actually have to do the schedules actually have a slightly different standard, just to confuse you, because they account for passing time between classes and also holidays, etc. They actually have a standard that says that a 3 credit hour course would only require about 35 hours of students in class. Now, historically, this distinction between in-class and out-of-class work was defined as a seat time requirement. So the question would be, how much seat time does a student need to have in order to get a certain number of credit hours? But very quickly, when we started to move online, it became clear that that language was a bit outdated. Obviously, students who are taking courses online are not actually in the classroom and do not have any seat time. So we needed to come up with a better way to capture the relevant distinction here, if there is a relevant distinction, but I think folks think that there is a relevant distinction. So the second attempt at talking about this distinction was to distinguish between contact hours and non-contact hours. So the idea would be that there is work that students do on their own, not in contact with others, and work that they do in contact with others. Now, some people interpret this to mean contact with the instructor. Others interpret it to mean, well, structured work by the instructor and perhaps contact with others as well. So given that that was a question and it wasn't clear whether these things had to be live or whether asynchronous work would work, one of the ways that folks have started to talk about this now, this distinction now, is a distinction between independent work and engaged work and hours. And so the idea is that of the total hours we expect of students, we expect 35 to 45 of those hours in a 3 credit hour course to be engaged. And that can be engagement with the instructor or engagement with other students. Essentially, the idea is that the engagement has to be with something that will respond back to them. And so it doesn't have to be live. It doesn't have to be a synchronous session. It could be a discussion board, for example, where there is feedback that comes back and forth from the professor or from students. But essentially, it can't just be sitting at home, working on your own, reading texts and teaching yourself the material. That's the kind of thing that is hopefully avoided, the kind of correspondence courses that we want to avoid. So one way to think about it, maybe, if you find this helpful, is that there are 3 broad categories of activities you might have your students engage in. You could have them be engaging in in-person engagement in class. You could have them have some activities that are online engagement, and you can have them engage in activities that are purely independent, reading, watching a lecture, for example. And one thing to note is that while there may be things that they do in class that seem like it's independent, like if you have students doing independent writing or independent reading, technically the way this works is that anything that happens in person counts as engagement time. And we might quibble with that and come up with a better standard down the road, but that's essentially how it works at this point. So again, if we go back to what a 3 credit hour course asks of students, one way to think about this distribution is that A 3-credit-hour course is asking for 90 hours of independent work from our students and about 45 hours, or if you're the registrar, about 35 hours of engaged work. And then whether that engaged work happens in person or online is what makes the difference between an in-person course, an online course, or a blended course in a traditional sense. So we'll talk more about this in our next video when we introduce what blended courses are.